If you desire an object that God has said no to, that's sin. That's not your sexual orientation. That's your sin orientation. And one of the challenges we have right now is we live in a world really downstream from Freud, downstream from Obergefell, and we're told that there is such a thing as a gay person, that it is a personhood issue, not that it is a sin issue.
Your story is that you were a professor of English and women's studies at Syracuse University. You were in a same-sex relationship for years, and then something insane happened, and you became a Jesus freak and got married to your husband, Kent, who's a Reformed Presbyterian pastor. You live in North Carolina. You're a homeschool mother. You speak around the country. But your story is an extraordinary story, and I just want to touch on that before we get into this book for people who aren't familiar with it. I've given the highlight.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the power of the gospel to change lives. I was a professor of English at Syracuse University. I was a coordinator of what was then called the Gay and Lesbian Studies program, and in very many ways I was hired and mentored and then tenured to make homosexuality look wholesome, which, you know, I to my shame, pulled off. So I wasn't just any old lesbian. I was the one you were not wanting to have to deal with.
I wasn't just any old lesbian.
No, not a garden variety one. No, I co-authored the university's domestic partnership policy, which, you know, steamrolled gay marriage. Listen, Eric, when I look at this world, my fingerprints are all over it. And I think about that every day. But I was working on a book on the religious right. Basically just wanted to know why people like you hated people like me. Straightforward question. I didn't need any more friends. I didn't care if I had any more enemies. I just had a question. And in the process, the Lord allowed me the amazing opportunity to get to know Ken Smith, who was the pastor of the Syracuse Reformed Presbyterian Church. He was also my neighbor. And after about 500 meals at his house, probably a conservative number there, and reading through the Bible 7 times with Ken, this was not, we weren't sitting around chatting about whatever. He didn't ask me how I felt. He didn't ask me if we needed a gay bowling league in the church. He genuinely wanted me to know that he accepted me as a lesbian, but he didn't approve because God didn't approve. And so I just put that out there because I think people don't understand. I came to faith under the doctrine of the Christian faith, not this garbage that you see out there right now. You know, the idea was that I would change, that God would capture my heart and I would desire him, and that I would change and no longer be gay. And so really, when I committed my life to Jesus, it wasn't because I stopped feeling like a lesbian or I was just kind of zapped. It was that the resurrection of Jesus Christ was true, and it was kind of it was a truth that I had no interpretive authority over. And that's when the hard stuff started in many, many ways.
Well, I mean, there's so much to talk about. Now, you wrote a memoir called The Secret Thoughts of an Unlikely Convert. And I recommend it. And one of the joys of talking to you and to Becket Cook and to so many others that I've spoken to over the years is to hear the stories of people who were in that world, who are not anymore in that world. Because we live in a world that has a narrative, and that narrative doesn't like to hear stories like yours or Becket Cook's. They say, no, that can't happen, that doesn't happen, those people are nuts. Well, it does happen. I have friends to whom it has happened. And it's an amazing thing when you hear the stories of transformation and suddenly you're confronted with the idea that this is possible. I lived in a world where I was told this is not possible, this cannot happen, and yet here's a story, and you know, you go into details in your story. But one of the reasons, as I said, it's a joy to have you on is just because there's so few places where you can hear stories like yours that give people hope that maybe my life can be different, or my friend who's going through this, or my relative who's going through this, maybe they can have hope. And so I just imagine that was one of your motivations for telling your story.
Oh, absolutely. But I would say my biggest motivation for telling my story was Kent and I were married, and we had adopted, at that point, 2 children out of foster care at the age of 16. I'm, I think, one of the few people I know who've adopted people who stand a foot taller than I am when I meet you for the first time. And, they thought I was just all cleaned up. And I wanted them to know I serve a God who can move mountains and can certainly change feelings. So if the question is, can God change my feelings? Oh, God can tell the mountain where to stand, and he can't change my feelings. Why do we think feelings are bigger than God? So I very much wrote it. I even dedicated it to my children because I wanted them to know that I serve a powerful God, and that you can too. And that is the gospel story. The gospel story is a story about change, of repentance and belief, turning. It's not a story about God just loving you right where you are and not expecting any change. That's ridiculous. Jesus Christ is the second Adam. He came to save us from our sins.
Now, I want to be.
And when we say we don't.
No, I was just going to say I want to be clear that when I'm talking to people who were once in this case in the gay lifestyle, it's like talking to somebody who used to sleep around with members of the opposite sex, and then they become a Christian and they stop doing that. There's a continuum in the sense of where those people are in terms of the struggle. Some people still have the desire. Sometimes it's still a strong desire. Sometimes it goes mostly away. Sometimes it goes all the way away. But the point is they're obedient to what God says. God says, no, you don't do that. I love you. You don't behave like that.
Yeah,
and that's
absolutely.
What's interesting, because there are people that would still say, well, I still experience same-sex attraction, but now I don't act on it. In the same way that, many men would say, well, I have longed for someone other than my spouse, but I don't do that. I don't go there because I know that God says, no, you don't do that. So, it's important that we, say that God is in the business of changing lives, but he does it in different ways every time. Sometimes it's just utterly miraculous. I mean, I know people that have been delivered from addictions like drug addictions instantly. Other people, it's a lifelong thing that they're dealing with, and it's just important to say that because the fact is God is God. He's going to do it the way he's going to do it.
Right. Could I add one more thing to that, though? It's also really, really important, and I think this is how mature Christians have to live. We need to learn how to hate our sin without hating ourselves. And so we can't coddle a sinful desire. If you desire an object that God has said no to, that's sin. That's not your sexual orientation. That's your sin orientation. And one of the challenges we have right now is we live in a world really downstream from Freud, downstream from Obergefell, and we're told that there is such a thing as a gay person, that it is a personhood issue, not that it is a sin issue. So you hear people say things like, well, but I'm gay and I'm made in the image of God. I'm trans and I'm made in the image of God. Well, separate that. Being made in the image of God is Genesis 1:27. It means that you were born male or female, and that you are called to reflect God's image in knowledge, righteousness, and holiness.
Okay, now we have to go to a break, but what you're saying now, you're bringing up the big point here.
Okay.
So when we come back, we're going to pick this up because, folks, this is the issue of our age, and we're going to get into the book. We'll be right back with Rosaria Butterfield. Hey there, folks. If you enjoy this video and want to see more interviews like this one, make sure to subscribe to my channel. Please just hit the subscribe button below. Click the notification bell so you don't miss new content every single week. 90% of you who watch are not subscribed, and you could be in the first 100,000 subscribers to my channel. I would love that. Please subscribe. God bless you. Welcome back, folks. I have the joy of speaking with Rosaria Butterfield, who is a brave and articulate voice in our time. She has a new book out called 5 Lies of Our Anti-Christian age, and I'm assuming that one of them is just what you were beginning to talk about, this idea that people say things like, well, I am gay. And I, similarly to you, would say, like, that doesn't compute. What does that mean? That's like somebody saying, like, you know, I'm an adulterer. What are you talking about? Like, this is behavior that you're saying must be okay, but the Bible says it's not okay. So where do you get this idea, this cultural idea that you're identified by the particular way that you are broken? We're all broken, right. But I don't identify myself somehow positively in terms of what God describes as brokenness.
Right. And you probably don't have a wolf for a pastor either. So you got that, that issue as well. I say that because these ideas have a battery to them, and the 5 lies are not just in the world, they're in the church, and that's part of the problem. But yeah, lie number 1 is that homosexuality is normal. And you hear that when people say things like, well, I'm gay and I'm made in the image of God. I'm trans and I'm made in the image of God. And it just confuses what personhood really means. Personhood means being made in God's image as a man or as a woman, which are distinct and separate and clear and binary categories of personhood, and reflecting that image in knowledge, righteousness, and holiness. Homosexuality and transgenderism come from the world, the flesh, and the devil. You can't be made in the image of God as the world, the flesh, and the devil. It is simply not possible. But the normalization of homosexuality, which was, a little bit of Freud and a whole lot of Obergefell, is where we are. And we have way too many hirelings in the evangelical church, way too many hirelings in these parachurch ministries, and nobody wanted to have the fight in the street. So what did they do? They hired Revoice, they have the gay Christians come in, and they simply try to make peace. But the problem is LGBTQ+ is the reigning idol of our day. There is no way to make peace with it. And Christians who say, oh, I want to just be a soft presence, oh yeah, I want to be a soft presence where? Here in Sodom? How'd that go for Lot?
Well, first of all, it's confusing. I mean, just to give an example, not far from where I live in New York, there's a very prominent Catholic church, which had this rainbow banner. And I thought to myself, whoa, that's the Catholic Church. They have been clear on abortion, so when I see a rainbow banner there, so you want to ask the question, what are you saying? And this is, to me, the key. And this is the Pope is way off on this. The American bishops are way off on this. And obviously, many evangelical churches are way off on this. But the message they're sending, and this is the key, folks, it's deliberately confusing. It's sort of not clear on, is this behavior good? They use terms like, we welcome diverse, we welcome. And I thought to myself, what church have I ever seen that doesn't welcome sinners? Like, of course you welcome. The question is, are you subtly saying that is not sin? What are you saying? And it seems to me that that's what's so diabolical, is that they're not being really clear. They're being deliberately confusing. That's kind of what they're doing on purpose.
Well, and I would say that is the function of an idol. An idol wants you. So there are 2 kind of ways of dealing with idolatry, right? You could be like, oh, look at Moloch over there. It's over there. But idolatry happens when we either are worshiping something we ought not, or just standing side by side with it, tolerating it. That's actually a function of worshiping that idol. But what you're describing is a classic, and you and I both know this because this is our former field, classic postmodern moment. You cede the moral language to the left as if the Bible doesn't have a moral language. And the minute you cede the moral language to the left, you're doing things like using transgender pronouns. You are using words like, marriage equity. You're talking about your beloved neighbors in the LGBTQ community and how to evangelize to them, instead of using biblical language, which very simply says, as you and I have both experienced, repent and flee. flee, run.
That's
If
way
you wanna-
too clear,
you wanna-
Rosaria. That's way too clear.
Well, you want to
Repent
evangelize that.
and flee. Yeah,
Well,
that's exactly
Eric, if you-
that's the healing message. That's true.
You know what happens if you evangelize the LGBTQ community accurately, powerfully, well, and God blesses it? There is no LGBTQ community. So
Well, that's
you see what I'm
easy.
saying?
That's easy to because the LGBTQ blah blah community, as we've said, whatever you think about the gay issue, there is no LGBTQ. There is no such community. Straight,
No.
I mean, gay men are not hanging out with lesbians who are not hanging out with the trans. Right? So this is a fiction created. Like there's this wonderful, happy rainbow group that they hang out together. Just starting there, that itself is a fiction.
But here's the unifying piece that we need to confront. You remember back in the old days when we would talk about leaving consenting adults alone? Boy, you haven't heard that expression in a while, have you?
No.
Well, the way that won the day was to create a bunch of straight allies who basically would just come up right alongside the gay community and say, look, we're just like you, we're all together. Those gay allies have become today's groomers of the especially just diabolical notion of the transgender child. And I am speaking to you fresh off of going to a Durham County school board meeting where that was the topic. And I will just say that if there's anyone out there who truly believes, as Jen Wilkins on the Gospel Coalition said recently, that sending your kids to public schools will give them a first-rate, world-class education, I don't know what planet, not in 2023, not when there's a federal mandate in your public schools to teach gender ideology as part of an anti-bullying clause, which means you can't take your kids out of it. So yesterday's allies are today's groomers, and the new issue really is horrific. It's this invention of the transgender child. With Christopher Rufo, which I think he's just a brilliant guy, he calls it the totem of the American left. Like the thing you poke on a stick and you stand behind it. Okay, that's what we're talking about.
Well, look, first of all, I have to ask, has the Gospel Coalition gone completely to hell? I mean, what in the world happened to the Gospel the Christianity
I have no
Today
idea.
has gone to hell?
Yeah.
I mean, it's astonishing that in not many years we have seen what were once respectable Christian organizations or institutions completely drift into the camp of the left. It's disheartening, but we have to be honest about it. It's really, these are no longer places that you want to be bothering with.
But it's challenging because it isn't a unified problem. It's a problem of pluralism. It's the David Frenchism of our day. It is the problem of pluralism. So you'll have a conservative, giving a good article, and then you'll have, some wacko saying something else. And so it leaves, and especially my book is written to the moms and the grandmas who have children lost to this madness. They don't have time to read 10 articles to figure out which one might say something. We need to give people a clear picture. Pluralism is the most cowardly form, I think, of being a postmodernist that you will see.
Well,
stand somewhere, church.
I want to say this. This reminds me of a few years ago, the now late Tim Keller, who I consider a friend. I loved him, but he said something that I found so preposterous. He said, I think everybody should read everything they can get their hands on critical race theory. And I thought to myself, yeah, if you're like a semi-retired brilliant pastor who has the time to wade through this garbage, but you might as well say to people like, you should look at all the pornographic literature you can just so you understand it better. It's like, no. A pastor or a leader needs to say to people, this stuff is bad, this stuff is Marxist, this stuff is diabolical, and you need to know it is evil. But kind of telling people, well, it's complicated and let's talk about it, that's the beginning of this confusion, which is deliberate on the part of those you're talking about and I'm talking about. They are deliberately confusing people. And I don't believe that that was Tim Keller's intention, but it's this kind of rarefied intellectual view. When the person in the pew doesn't have time for that, they need to know, is this sort of good or sort of bad? What is it? And what you're saying, Rosaria, and I've been talking about this a lot wherever I go, these lies have come into the church. That is what is so horrific, that there are many in the church who've opened their arms to confusion, to lies, to heresy, and they always do it in a way that's very clever. They're kind of, it's sort of Christian, except it's of the devil. That's, to me, the ultimate devilishness of these kinds of things, is that they borrow, as you just said, from Christian truth. It's about compassion. It's about, these things that they will deceive you if you don't have discernment, if you don't have clarity. And I guess this is why you wrote your book, 5 Lies of Our Anti-Christian Age, because people need to understand what is happening.
Absolutely. And I mean, I would say in addition to that, it is very satanic. We need to remember that it's not just a sin to tell a lie. It's also a sin to believe one. So for the people who are passively sitting in churches where you have a wolf for a pastor, but you've been there for 30 years and it used to be okay, and there's no time for nostalgia. I think what's really happening, Eric, is that people don't seem to know that this is spiritual warfare.
Right.
This isn't just like a nice picnic. This is the real deal. And also, this is the moment that the Lord has made us for. So, I think I mentioned that I survived speaking not once, but twice to the local school board on the subject of transgenderism and parental rights. And one of the things that you see is that often, if there are other conservatives speaking, which I'm very glad for, if there's no gospel, then what about all the people who have agreed to castrate their children because they thought Joe Biden's interpretation of the 14th Amendment was right? What about the children who will be incontinent and infertile for life because of, as they grow into adulthood, all of the years of testosterone on a woman's body? The world knows how, even the conservative world knows how to hold these people up as an example of what not to be. But we're Christians. We don't throw people away. We want to proclaim the gospel that says that the greatest news ever is that God won't be mocked. He made you a man, and you could mock that in your delusion. But in the New Jerusalem, when Jesus comes back, you will be resurrected, and you will not be maimed. It's not possible. So the need for Christians to get in the game and to get out of the slumber of nostalgia is so that you can be some good to these people. And the other issue is I have a lot of, this is also written to all the moms and grandmas who write to me and to my website and to say, but what about my daughter? What about my grandson? I had one woman speak to me recently who said, my daughter, who's a lesbian, has decided she's non-binary and she's going to raise my 3-year-old grandson as a girl to save the world from toxic masculinity. And I live in a state where all this is okay. Well, you need to help that grandma. I need to help that grandma know that there's a way to try to stay connected to this, I think at this point, crazy daughter, without becoming indoctrinated, because that grandson is not a trans child. He's an abused child, and he needs immediate help. So I think it's really imperative that we understand that. I know it's hard to leave a church. I know it's hard to realize that, as Aaron Renn has said, this is negative world. You got to have some different tactics than you had, 15 years ago before Obergefell. Obergefell was a big line in the sand because not only did it institutionalize and legalize gay marriage, it also codified something called dignitary harm, which means you're harming people in a legal sense if you fail to affirm their LGBTQ dignity. It used to be harm was material. They lost a job or something like that. So that's why people, and I just talk to Christians all the time who had no idea that's in the mix. And that was 2015. We're looking at, we're pushing now a decade and looking at the fruit of this. Christians, we need you in the game, and your lost children need you in the game.
And I want to say, which I think I already said it, but I say everywhere I go, I say to people, if you're going to a church, which I think the technical term is a dead church, a useless church, the devil's kind of church that is not in this game, that doesn't believe in spiritual warfare, that doesn't believe in taking the gospel out of the pews and into the real world. If you're going to one of those churches that is not dealing with this stuff, folks, God is going to judge you for sitting in those pews. You need to get out of those pews, go to a church. It would be better that people don't go to a church and get fed online until you can find a good church, because these churches are coddling us, or it's almost like they're keeping us asleep as though these issues don't concern us. We can just talk about Jesus and avoid this kind of stuff. And folks, that's the church not being the church. And there's so many people wasting God's time and God's money in going to these churches. These churches need to wither and die because they are not fighting with God in this battle for people he loves. To me, it's just astonishing that these churches exist.
Absolutely. And if I could just add something to that, just to repeat, there's no time for nostalgia, but do you realize if you are in a church like that the whole world is already rebuking you? Because you have something like Tavistock, the largest pediatric gender, quote unquote, affirming clinic in the world, who shut down this year because internal activists, that's LGBTQ, aficionados, who are blowing the whistle, risking their lives to do so. And yet you've got, these just fools in dead churches and in, semi-alive churches in some cases who can't even answer a question directly. Here, let me answer it directly. Homosexuality is a sin. It violates the creation ordinance. Transgenderism is a sin. It's the sin of envy. It is the sin of violating the 10th commandment, and it also violates the creation ordinance. If we can't just say that simply, why not? If I could just land the plane on one salient point that we need to think about, and that is that so much of these lies were driven by feminism. And I don't know if you've noticed, but there's only one place that feminism is alive and well, and it's in the evangelical church, because feminism in the world is dead. Transgenderism killed it. And I think this is a really important thing, especially for Christian women, to realize. If you really want to rail against biblical patriarchy, I'm not talking about He-Man patriarchy. I'm talking about father rule, the godly men, your godly husband, your godly pastor. You really want to rail against that? Well, how do you feel about transgender patriarchy? Because that's what you got. So I think we have to look at these things and see where they are going, and be wise and be rational and not be sentimental and have courage. But this is a fight we need to have on the streets. We need to have it right now. And what I mean by that is Christians need to be Christians in the world. We need to do it. We need to stop being so timid. I'm going to tell you, I'm living proof. I go to these meetings. I give my little 3-minute speech. Some dude in a skirt cries. Sometimes a board member will take a point of privilege and tell me that I'm white, articulate, and educated, and that leaves me wondering. And that's meant as an insult, by the way. It's a bit of a freak show, but if the conservatives don't show up, do we feel like we have any responsibilities in this world? And again, what about our kids? What about our grandchildren? If we're not fighting the fight, how can they do it?
Because the flag still stands for freedom, and they can't take